Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our fourth and second to last video on disorders. Today, we are talking about a fascinating, at least to me, terrifying disorder. One of the more famous psychological disorders, really a big one in the field of psychology, schizophrenia. Key terms are on the right there. We are just focusing on this one disorder today. Here we go. Starting you off with the video, I'm not even going to explain it. I just want you guys to see a patient with this disease to start off with and notice how they act, how they behave. Don't worry, there's going to be words on the screen. Don't worry about writing them down. I just want you to note this patient's symptoms as we watch. Here we go.
How are you doing? I'm doing so hot. I think and feel as though people have called me here to electrocute me, judge me, put me in jail, or kill me, electrocute me because of some of the sins I've been in.
Is this a new feeling for you?
The main thing is don't get excited, but the thing is it's not a new feeling, no.
Notice a couple things about him. He's obviously twirling his hair on top of his head constantly. His answer to that question really didn't make sense. It didn't follow with what the question is saying. It just sort of seemed like his thinking came out of nowhere.
I'm scared of people.
Must be very frightening for you, though. Feel like you're about to get killed.
I'm so scared I can tell you that picture's got a headache.
Again, notice a couple of things. He's freaked out. He's scared of people around him. He's paranoid. And he just, again, said something that made absolutely no sense. I'm so scared. I can tell you that picture's got a headache.
Can you tell me more about that? The picture has a headache?
You want to know?
Yes, I do.
Okay, when a sperm and an egg go together to make a baby, only one sperm goes up in the egg. And when they touch, there's two contact points that touch before the other two. And then it's carried up into the egg. And when they fuse, it's like nuclear fusion, except it's human fusion. There's a mass loss of the proton. One heat abstraction goes up in the electron, spins around, comes back down into the proton to form the mind. And the mind can be reduced to one atom.
At this point, what would you like us to do for you?
I would like you to get me off of cigarettes, get me dried out, cleaned up, so I can go home and get a job in a bakery and go to medical school.
So that is one man with schizophrenia. Let's look a little bit more at what this disorder actually entails. So what is schizophrenia? The first thing to note about this, and the way that this is different from all the other disorders that we've looked at so far, schizophrenia is the closest thing to the sort of stereotypical cultural association of quote unquote crazy that we have. If you think of the word crazy in a stereotypical way, that's a schizophrenic. So schizophrenia, the dictionary definition, a psychological disorder characterized by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and or diminished or inappropriate emotional expression. And we'll look at each of those. It is not having multiple personalities. Sometimes people get that confused. They think schizophrenia is when you have multiple different personalities that you switch back and forth between. That's a different disorder that we will look at tomorrow. Schizophrenia is the chief example of psychosis, which is a group of disorders in which you lose contact with reality. So the real thing to understand about schizophrenia is every other disorder that we have looked at so far, you can kind of empathize with people who have that disorder, even though you may not have it yourself. So for example, you can maybe understand what it's like to have constant anxiety or to have an obsession with something, even if you don't have an anxiety disorder or OCD, because you've experienced some form of those emotions and that psychological state in your own life. So it gives you the ability to empathize. If you do not have schizophrenia, you have no ability to understand what the world is like for a schizophrenic, because they are detached because of what is happening in their brain from reality. They are seeing things potentially, or hearing things, or smelling things that are not there. They are thinking in a way that a quote unquote normal person does not think. They're just not following logical, or what we would consider logical, trains of thought. They are removed, in other words, completely from the reality of the world and of the people around them. So let's dig into these symptoms here, a few at a time. This piece of art on the left is made by a schizophrenic. I included it because it shows a few different things. It shows the sort of helter-skelter, disorganized nature of the disease. It's sort of like almost you can imagine this art as like a snapshot inside a schizophrenic person's brain. And it also is sort of ominous or kind of freaky looking. You might say it's a little bit scary. And that sort of terror is also a part of many schizophrenics' lives. It's different from anxiety, in which you're anxious. This is like abject terror in response to the world around you, in large part because it doesn't make sense to you. Your thoughts are disorganized, you are hallucinating, so on and so forth. So what's going on more specifically in a schizophrenic's mind? Oftentimes a schizophrenic is having delusions, which is a false belief. These delusions often relate to either a false belief about persecution or a false belief about grandeur. Persecution would be, I think people are out to get me. This is very similar to paranoia. I'm walking down the street and I see somebody and I think they're going to do something bad to me. When you saw that video at the start, that guy thought he was scared of everybody around him. He has a false delusion of persecution. On the flip side, you might have a delusion of grandeur. And this is the idea or the belief that you are extraordinarily important, significant, that you matter in a way maybe beyond how you actually do. That delusion of grandeur, you think you are way more important than maybe you actually are relative to other people. Hallucinations are false sensory experiences. You're, again, smelling things, seeing things, hearing things that are not there. Most often in schizophrenics, it's going to be seeing things or hearing things. And again, oftentimes these are terrifying for a schizophrenic. A schizophrenic might be walking down the street and see scenes of horrific violence, like a person with half their head blown off walking next to them. It's not, a sort of popular thing that you hear in some schizophrenics is that they hear voices that they think are either God or the devil telling them to do terrible things, telling them to kill people, telling them to hurt people, telling them to hurt themselves. These hallucinations can be with them all the time. And beyond that, disorganized thinking is just an inability to keep your thinking on track. You can't maintain a logical stream of thought. If things break down, you go in weird directions. You just can't focus yourself, your attention or your train of thought on something in particular. This is often resulting from a breakdown in selective attention, which you'll remember is your ability to focus on a specific thing in a specific moment or over the course of several moments. For example, right now as you watch this video, you are focused on the video. You are hopefully, if you're in a place with a few distractions, ignoring random stuff going around on maybe outside, the sounds of cars going by, or the sights of the room around you. You're focused on the video. A schizophrenic oftentimes lacks that ability to really have selective attention. Another really big thing that you'll see often is diminished or inappropriate emotion. So this is basically your emotional state has shrunk to just neutral. You don't demonstrate emotion at all. And here's another example of a patient who is undergoing that particular phenomenon.
There's going to be a hearing tomorrow to see whether or not there's any legal basis why you have to stay here.
I'm not crazy.
If it was up to you, would you like to leave the hospital tomorrow?
I'd like to leave the hospital tomorrow because I've got things I got to do.
Okay, well, I'm
This is the first
I'm
of the
gonna
month,
be-
and there's a lot of rent to be paid
Right.
and all that.
okay. What brought you into the hospital?
I turned myself in on a 5150 because I felt like killing myself.
Okay, so you came here voluntarily.
So I could stop from killing myself.
And what was going on that you felt like killing
It was
yourself?
3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep. All the same thoughts kept racing through my mind over and over and over again. I just wanted them to stop, period. And I thought, well, if I kill myself, I'll stop thinking.
So again, notice his tone of voice and his expression as he is talking about considering suicide. He's completely neutral. He's not sad. He's not happy. He's not angry. He's nothing. He has no emotion in his face or in his voice. This flat affect is very often a symptom, again, of schizophrenia. So how does schizophrenia develop? Interestingly enough, there is sort of a sweet spot or unsweet spot, I guess you could say, of people as they mature into adulthood when schizophrenia really becomes prevalent. That's, 17 to 23, I would say roughly is the window when most people develop schizophrenia. It affects around 1% of people. That might be a little bit inflated, honestly. That's according to a textbook I pulled that from, up to 1%, let's call it. And there's no documented gender difference in schizophrenia, but males are hit harder by it. They're struck earlier and they're struck more severely. They're much more likely to struggle with worse symptoms over a longer period of time. Schizophrenia may appear suddenly, or it might develop gradually over time. You might all of a sudden start to see things, hear voices, feel yourself disconnect from reality and sort of spiral into this other world. Or it may be a very, very gradual thing. It could be either. There are positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Positive being sort of like in operant conditioning when something is added in. So for example, you add in emotions. And the negative symptoms would be when something is taken away. So for example, your emotional ability is taken away. Schizophrenia has both of those. And an important thing too to note about schizophrenia, as we talk about that point, is that it affects different people in different ways. It's sort of in some ways a broader diagnosis than something like generalized anxiety disorder would be. Not every schizophrenic has all the symptoms we've discussed so far. Some schizophrenics don't hallucinate. Some schizophrenics don't sort of have that catatonic, flat emotional state. It just kind of depends on the person. But there's also chronic and acute schizophrenia. Chronic would be when it is ongoing for a long period of time, sort of throughout a person's life. Acute would be when it strikes quickly and intensely, but is over a smaller duration of time. If you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, if you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, this is about John Nash, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, who was a brilliant, brilliant man who struggled with schizophrenia throughout his life, and in fact spent many years of his career doing what he thought was government research about the Soviet Union that in fact was all completely made up and nonsense, because he was a schizophrenic and he was hallucinating all of these people who he thought he was working with and assignments that he thought he had that just were not there. Fascinating, fascinating movie if you ever have the time to watch it. So again, let's think about why schizophrenia develops, just like we've done with some other ones. First, we're going to hit the biology a little bit. This video explains it better than I do, so I'm going to let it take it away.
Prevailing theory around the biological basis of schizophrenia revolves around two core neurotransmitters. So one of them, which has been sort of long-standing, is around the role of dopamine and the impact dopamine has, in particular dysfunction in dopamine signaling and its role in producing both positive symptoms as well as negative and cognitive symptoms. The other prevailing theory around the neurobiology of schizophrenia revolves around glutamate and hypofunction of the NMDA receptor.
So one of the major ways of understanding schizophrenia has been the dopamine hypothesis. And it arose from the fact that if you give people drugs that increase dopamine, they often get psychotic-like symptoms, and all our current treatments work by blocking the dopamine system. So it's very logical, and in fact it's correct to sustain, that dopamine has a role in schizophrenia. But what we're learning more and more is that dopamine has a role in producing the symptoms of schizophrenia. But the fundamental abnormality in the illness may actually arise from some combination of genetic defects along with some environmental insults, which lead to neurodevelopmental problems, which finally lead to dopamine. So in other words,
you are hearing now another example of the gene-environment interaction. Some people are more likely to have schizophrenia because of genetics, but they have environmental triggers that are going to set off the onset of that schizophrenia.
if you wanted to make a fundamental change in schizophrenia, you'd have to work at a step back from dopamine. So then what might be these steps, one step back from dopamine? And I think that at the moment is up for a lot of scientific debate. People would often use the word neurodevelopment, and I think that's a very fair thing to say, but neurodevelopment is not one thing and doesn't happen over one period of time. When you talk in terms of transmitter systems in the brain, I think one hot target at the moment is the glutamate system. And that there is an understanding that the glutamate system in some ways controls the dopaminergic dysfunction. And if one could address the glutamate system primarily or secondarily, one would be able to get better treatment, or one might be effective in people in whom the current antipsychotics don't work.
So a little bit more about biological causes other than the neurotransmitters that you just heard about. With the help of brain scans, as always, we can identify different parts of the brain that are affected in a schizophrenic person. For example, if someone who's hallucinating, you're going to see, interestingly enough, a lot of increased activity in the thalamus. I would have at least have thought, you know, before I learned this, I would have assumed it would have been like the sensory cortex. You know, you're hallucinating, you would think that, you know, something having to do with the senses would be going on. Maybe the temporal lobe if it's hearing, or the occipital lobe for vision. But no, it's actually the thalamus that is going crazy. If you're paranoid, this made a little bit more sense to me when I first learned about it. It's increased activity in the amygdala. We know that the amygdala deals with fear and aggression, so it would make sense that the amygdala would be spazzing out if you are paranoid. Schizophrenics tend to have their cerebral tissue shrinks a little bit, interestingly enough. So in other words, their cerebral cortexes are not as thick as the normal person's. And there's, you know, the video that we just watched talked about sort of the potential genetic causes. There's not like one or two genes that we can point to and be like, that is the schizophrenic gene, like that is the problem. The research on schizophrenia today more points to what was called a cocktail, if you will, of genes. So a variety of different genes working together, working in conjunction with each other, and again, meeting that environment and interacting with those sort of environment factors together are what kind of cause the onset of schizophrenia. One really fascinating piece of research of some correlational studies that have been done is that there does appear to be a link, you know, a strong correlation between certain illnesses during a mom's pregnancy and the onset of schizophrenia in her children. So for example, if a woman has the flu when she is pregnant, her child, when that child is born, and then, you know, 20 years later or so, when that child is becoming a young adult, that child is much more likely to have schizophrenia. And we don't really have a great explanation yet for why that is. We've just identified a potential correlation. Some other early warning signs, if that schizophrenia might be onsetting. Again, there is a genetic impact, and there does seem to be something on the X chromosome related to that, because if you have a mother with severe and long-lasting schizophrenia, that means it's much more likely to set on in yourself. Sort of similar to the sick mom thing that I just talked about in the last slide. If you have complications at birth, or if as a young child you are separated from your parents for an extended period of time, you are more likely to develop schizophrenia. People with short attention spans and poor muscle coordination throughout childhood, again, this is all just correlational. We haven't established cause and effect or anything like that, but there is a correlation there between those things and the development of schizophrenia. And similarly, those who are disruptive or withdrawn, more likely to develop schizophrenia. The last two are, you know, you would again probably predict if you're unpredictable emotionally, if you have bad relationships with the people around you, that might be an early warning sign that schizophrenia is going to set upon you. So that is it about schizophrenia. Post a question on Google Classroom, and looking forward to talking about it a little bit and seeing some panel presentations from you guys tomorrow.